Hey, Richard Myers here. Thank you for joining me for a brief moment. In this past year, my wife and I were privileged enough to travel some in Europe. And as we went through, we were on a river cruise, and civilization developed around the rivers because in earlier times, the way to travel was along the riverways. Networks of roads were scarce. And as we traveled, and as you get the stories and go on the tours and the excursions, I realized that prior to the Industrial Revolution, in other words, everything earlier, the Middle Ages and earlier, virtually all of human civilization was living in a subsistence uh, uh, way. In other words, they had subsistence living. Now, uh, I looked that word up, and I just want to make sure I had the right descriptor. And one of the other things that my wife and I were doing, we went camping. We camped out, slept in a tent, and so in my meditations, I was thinking camping is probably the closest thing that we get to subsistence living, unless we're homeless, of course. In other words, you have just as much food and resources that you need to stay alive. Virtually all of your efforts, as you get up in the morning, all of your efforts is survival, obtaining food, keeping yourself clean, providing shelter, on and on and on. So subsistence living is where all of your effort is devoted to survival. It's like camping out or being homeless, I guess you might say. So I would say, and you could do your own research, that most of human civilization lived at the subsistence level prior to the Industrial Revolution. And it's only in the modern era, modernity, it's only in the last 100 years, and maybe in the last 60 or 70 years, we have an increasing amount of free time and less effort to just survival issues. Life became much more productive, much more creative, and so forth and so on. And so that's where this is going today. So here's the thing: we have in the seminaries, in the Christian academic world, we have this assertion that we give priority, we give more credibility to Christians who were earlier. So now I'm not talking about the beginning of the church in the first century, but after the first century, we had people that wrote documents and explanations of what they thought the scripture meant, interpretations and so forth. And what's happened in the academic world of the Christian seminaries, they give priority to those people who wrote early as opposed to us who are writing later. And I wanted to I'm working with this book by Lee Brainerd, Apostasia. He spends an entire book on that one word. And what he does early on, he says that those people who were in that day, he said, let me read this sentence. It seems reasonable to assume that they were more likely to have a native grasp on its force, i.e. the meaning of the word, than anyone in our generation. Now, I would say, I think that's categorically false. But I realize that everybody does that. Everybody does that. They give priority. But if you realize that all of the people that lived virtually prior to the Industrial Revolution were living at the subsistence level, people didn't have time to study and to think and to write to any extent unless you were very wealthy, or you might be wealthy because of your parents, so that it's nothing that your intelligence or your expertise or your abilities didn't contribute to you being wealthy. and or you were a part of an institution, and therefore you were beholden to the positions, the dogma, if you will, of the institution that you were connected to. And so I would question this. I would just say, is that true? And if you look at it from a reasonable standpoint, put yourself in the shoes of those people living in the 2nd century and the 3rd century and onward through the Middle Ages. Virtually everyone, their entire life was taken up with survival. They were living at a subsistence level. Now, I want somebody to argue with me on this point, and or if they weren't at a subsistence level, they were beholden to an institution. They were being supported by, they were living off of the wealth and proceeds of an institution. Now, even those people who had the ability to hire people to take care of their survival needs, to hire servants and so forth, still, because of just the difficulty of life, they didn't have just taking care of the needs to keep clean, to keep dressed, and to feed yourself took most of the day. You might have a very limited amount of time, virtually no light to work after dark, and so you might have a few hours a day. Well, in my own case, I might have 10, 15, 20 hours in a day to study and to think and to write and to be creative. It takes me 20 minutes to get to take care of any needs to get a shower and brush my teeth and eat breakfast, and 20 minutes and I'm good for the day. And so I have almost no time spent on my survival needs. And today we have word processing, and it's just amazing when you really begin to examine the advantage that we have over those people who lived at a subsistence level during the Middle Ages and well prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm just saying it makes no sense that those people would know more than we do. Now let's say that you say, well, wait a minute, they lived in the context where people were speaking the language. But let's think about this. They couldn't travel any distances, and if they did, it took days to travel. And so in their lifetime, they may have traveled some, but they couldn't have covered very much territory, so they didn't have a broad spectrum exposure to the language. They didn't have a huge library at their disposal. And now, in the last 10 years, we have searchable databases. And one of the things that happened that I want you to know about is from the 18th century on, I'm not sure of the exact dates, we had not thousands but tens of thousands of documents, receipts and documents from all of the ages going back to the period before the Lord was born. And so we have a better grasp of the language than they had. They couldn't have had the kind of exposure to the language, the broad spectrum exposure to the language that we have through searchable databases. Now, Lee graduated from college probably 20, 30 years ago, and so he may not be aware of what's happened in the last 10 years or what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm sure that he is. I don't mean to demean him, but I'm just saying that his assertion that those who lived in the 1st century would know more than we do, when you examine it and would you put yourself in their shoes and in their thick and unclean clothing and in their cold and damp houses and in their inability to find clean water and so on. I mean, if you just start examining their lifestyle, boy, you just realize it was a tough life, and they did not have the time that we might think they have to become theologians and to do the kind of in-depth thinking and study and have the broad spectrum exposure that we have today. And so I just want to question, I said, it doesn't make any sense. Think about it. And so his assertion that somebody early, so I'm saying people who in the last 10 or 15 years writing, those young people have a much, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude and maybe more advantage over anybody earlier than them, even in the 1st century, 1900s. Now, I wrote my thesis in 1974 or 5, right in that period. No one in the world had covered the subject that I addressed, and that was the calling to ministry. You might think that's strange, but there was no one who had studied and written on that except one master's thesis in a Bible school in South Africa. And it took me more than a month to get a copy of that thesis. And so, I mean, it was difficult. To write your thesis, it took weeks. Now you can do the same research in a matter of a few days, a few hours. It used to be that in order for a university to offer a PhD, you had to have a huge library because you wanted the PhD candidates to have the broadest exposure. Now, everybody has access, and if you have a few $100s to pay the subscription fees for databases, you've got total access to an incredible amount of information on searchable databases. And so I would say in my lifetime, everything has changed. And I had, when I was young, I still had tremendous advantages and freedoms that people 50 years, my parents and my grandparents, did not have. And so I just question that assertion, and I'd like you to think about it, especially if you're in a graduate program. Think about the advantages we have and give weight to the work that's being done now, and it's more accurate, more thorough than the work that was done early on. Anyway, hey, just I'm going to deal more with this, but just wanted to give you that challenge. Thank you.